In the last 3 Nigerian presidential elections, the candidate who controlled the most state governors, not the most votes, won every single time. Think about that for a moment. Not the candidate with the largest rallies, not the candidate with the loudest social media, not even the candidate the polls said was ahead. The one with the governors. Now ask yourself this. As of today, one political bloc is quietly engineering gubernatorial control in 7 swing states simultaneously. And this is happening 2 years before the 2027 election. The restructuring is not happening on the floor of the National Assembly. It is not happening on any campaign trail. It is happening in boardrooms, in federal appointment letters, and in the quiet defection meetings that nobody in mainstream media is connecting. So here is the question nobody is asking. If the 2027 election is going to be decided by structural power that is being assembled right now, who is building that structure and who handed them the tools to do it? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will see the architecture clearly. Before we go further, if you're new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand what is happening, you need to start not with what politicians are saying publicly, but with what they are doing quietly. Beginning in the first quarter of this year, a cluster of high-profile party movements began across Nigeria, serving governors signaling departure from their current parties, former ministers attending what were described publicly as consultations, and National Assembly bloc leaders repositioning in ways that, taken individually, look like normal political activity. Taken together, they tell a very different story. The trigger was not one single event, it was a pattern. At least 2 sitting governors publicly declared intent to exit their parties ahead of the 2027 cycle. Almost simultaneously, a wave of federal appointments began flowing into precisely the states where those governors hold office. Appointments in agencies, parastatals, and federal infrastructure projects. The sequencing was not coincidental. When you see a governor announce a political shift and federal contracts arrive in a state within weeks, you are not watching 2 separate events. You are watching one transaction. The initiating logic here is resource leverage. Those who control federal allocation, those who decide which state gets which agency posting, which road contract, which security deployment, can incentivize political realignment without making a single public statement. No press conference is required, no public threat is necessary. The money moves and the politics follows. Now, why is this happening now in 2025 when the election is in 2027? This is the part most Nigerians do not realize. Nigeria's electoral cycle means that party primaries for the 2027 presidential election will begin as early as late 2026, which means the structural power play underway right now is operating exactly 18 months ahead of when most ordinary Nigerians will start paying attention. By the time the average voter starts thinking about 2027, the foundation will already be set. And INEC's own voter registration data supports this reading. There has been a documented surge in new voter registration in 6 specific states. All of them are battleground states. That is not organic civic enthusiasm, that is organized mobilization. For historical context, consider 2015. Most Nigerians remember 2015 as the election where an incumbent lost for the first time in Nigerian democratic history. What fewer people remember is that the APC merger, the political vehicle that made that victory possible, was assembled 24 months before election day, not 6 months. The governors who crossed, the senators who realigned, the northern bloc that consolidated, none of that happened spontaneously. It was architected in advance. The lesson of 2023 reinforced this further. The candidate with the highest voter enthusiasm in the South collapsed in critical states because the structural gubernatorial infrastructure was not there. Voter preference and electoral outcome are not the same thing in Nigeria's current institutional environment, and understanding that gap is the beginning of understanding what is happening right now. In a moment, I am going to show you which specific institution is the single most important lever in this entire operation, and I will tell you now it is not the one you think. When Nigerians think about electoral institutions, the name that comes to mind first is INEC, the Independent Electoral Commission. And INEC matters enormously, but the analysis of INEC's role is usually incomplete because it focuses on what INEC does on election day rather than on the structural environment within which INEC operates every other day of the year. INEC's funding flows through the Consolidated Revenue Fund. In principle, this insulates it from direct executive control. In practice, the pace, volume, and predictability of that funding is subject to the same political pressures that govern every federal allocation in Nigeria. INEC's commissioner appointments, its state-level operational capacity, and its ability to resist political interference in result collation are all shaped by an environment that the federal executive has significant influence over. The word independent in INEC's name reflects an constitutional aspiration. Whether that aspiration is matched by operational reality in any given election cycle is a different question entirely. The Electoral Act of 2022 introduced genuine reforms. The legal framework is better today than it was in 2015. Electronic accreditation is more robust. The provisions around result transmission have been strengthened. But here's the distinction that matters. Institutional reform and institutional independence are not the same thing. You can improve the rules of a game while leaving the power dynamics around that game entirely unchanged. The ambiguities that remain in the Electoral Act around electronic transmission in areas of network failure, around the definition of substantial compliance in tribunal proceedings, around the timelines for electoral disputes, are not accidental oversights. They are the precise points where legal contests will be fought if 2027 produces a disputed outcome.
Now, there is an institution that is almost never mentioned in this conversation, and it is the most important one in this entire analysis. The State Independent Electoral Commissions, the SIECs. These bodies are responsible for local government elections across Nigeria's 36 states. They are appointed by state governors. They are funded by state executives. They operate almost entirely outside of public scrutiny. And they are the mechanism through which local government chairmen are produced, which means they are the mechanism through which ward-level party structures are controlled. Ward delegates determine who wins party primaries. Party primaries determine who appears on the ballot in the general election. Control the SIECs and you control the primaries. Control the primaries and the general election becomes, at best, a confirmation exercise. The National Assembly adds another layer. The Senate's composition and internal leadership alignment directly shapes which electoral reform bills advance and which die in committee without public explanation. When senators who benefit from the current structural environment sit on the committees responsible for electoral law, the reform process faces a structural conflict of interest that no amount of civil society pressure can easily resolve from the outside. And finally, the Federal Executive Council's discretionary spending powers over ministries, departments, and agencies create leverage over state governors that is informal but decisive. A governor facing a revenue shortfall, and in the current economic environment many are, is a governor who is structurally vulnerable to federal pressure. That vulnerability is not exploited through open coercion. It is exploited through the careful management of what flows in and what does not. Here is a fact that should concern every Nigerian watching this. In the 2023 general election, INEC's own internal processes flagged result collation anomalies in multiple states. The institutional response to those anomalies, what was investigated, what was resolved, what was published, has never been made fully transparent to the Nigerian public. That opacity is not a malfunction of the system. In many respects, that opacity is the system. There is one actor in this story who has stayed completely silent throughout all of this. No press statements, no interviews, no public positioning of any kind. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that silence is the loudest signal of all. Here is where the analysis becomes most important and most counterintuitive. The political bloc with the most to gain from the current structural realignment is not necessarily the one with the most popular support nationally. It is the one that can deliver what political strategists call structural certainty, guaranteed gubernatorial cooperation in the 6 to 8 states that have historically determined presidential outcomes in Nigeria. Since 1999, the Southwest, the Northwest, and the Federal Capital Territory together have determined the decisive margin in every presidential election. You do not need to win all 3 of those zones to win the presidency. You need to control 2 of them convincingly. The strategic operation currently underway is not targeting the entire country with equal intensity. It is targeting those 3 zones with surgical precision. Consider who risks losing influence in this environment. Opposition figures who built their political capital on popular legitimacy, on grassroots mobilization, on mass rallies, on social media reach, face a narrowing window. Popular legitimacy is real and important, but in Nigeria's current electoral architecture, popular legitimacy without institutional infrastructure cannot reliably convert into electoral outcomes. The 2023 cycle demonstrated this with painful clarity. You can fill Tafawa Balewa Square, you can trend nationally on every platform, and you can still lose in the collation room. The most structurally vulnerable actors in this realignment are not the major opposition leaders. They are the mid-tier figures, sitting senators, state assembly members, local government chairmen, who are being peeled away from their original political alignments through a combination of targeted federal appointments and constituency project funding. A senator who receives a federal appointment for his brother-in-law is a senator who becomes more careful about how loudly he criticizes the federal executive. A state assembly member whose constituency project funding doubles is a state assembly member whose independence quietly shrinks. This is not corruption in the crude sense, it is structural co-optation, and it is the primary mechanism through which political blocs are assembled in Nigeria. The North-Central Zone deserves particular attention here. The Middle Belt has long been treated as a swing region, competitive, unpredictable, not securely in any single political camp. That competitive status is now being actively contested by multiple political blocs simultaneously. The logic is straightforward. Whoever consolidates the North Central creates a buffer zone between the far north and the south that complicates any opposition coalition building strategy. The political investment being directed into that zone right now, in appointments, in infrastructure announcements, in security dialogue, is disproportionate to its population size. That disproportion tells you exactly how strategically it is being valued. In the South-South and Southeast, the dynamic is different. These zones are being shaped less through positive patronage and more through a combination of federal security presence and selective economic engagement. The history of using security deployment to demobilize political opposition in the Niger Delta and in the Southeast is well documented. When security operations intensify in regions that are also electoral battlegrounds in the approach to an election cycle, the question that analysts must ask is not only what security objective is being served, but what political objective is being enabled.
The silent stakeholders in this story are perhaps the most significant. Business interests with major federal contracts in infrastructure, in oil and gas, in telecommunications, in banking have powerful incentives to back whoever they assess as the most likely winner, regardless of policy alignment. These interests do not hold press conferences. They do not attend political rallies. They move through quiet meetings, through the strategic placement of individuals on boards and in advisory roles, and through the careful timing of business announcements that signal confidence in particular political outcomes. Their movement in the months ahead will be a more reliable leading indicator of where structural power is settling than anything you will read in a newspaper. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. What does any of this mean for the ordinary Nigerian, the teacher in Kaduna, the trader in Onitsha, the civil servant in Abuja, the fisherman in Bayelsa? This is the question that political analysis too often neglects. Let me be direct about the stakes. The concentration of structural electoral power at the federal level is not a problem that belongs only to 2027. It is a federalism problem, one that compounds with each election cycle. Every time a governor survives politically by aligning with federal patronage rather than by delivering for his state, the informal constitution of Nigerian governance shifts slightly further away from federal balance and slightly further toward federal dependence. The governors who emerge from that environment govern differently. They govern with one eye always on Abuja. And when a governor's primary political obligation is to the federal patron rather than to his constituents, service delivery suffers. Roads that should be built are not built, hospitals that should be equipped are not equipped, schools that should be staffed are not staffed.
The political cost of this arrangement is paid by citizens who have no direct role in the transaction. The economic dimension is equally serious. When political stability is manufactured through patronage rather than earned through legitimate electoral competition, there is a direct fiscal cost. Patronage expenditure competes with capital expenditure in every budget cycle. The money that flows into political loyalty payments, into appointments, into constituency projects structured as political rewards, into security arrangements that serve electoral rather than civilian purposes, is money that does not flow into productive infrastructure. The Nigerian voter pays this cost twice, once through taxes and again through the under-governance that results from a political system oriented toward power retention rather than service delivery. Here is the connection that most analysts are not making clearly enough. The geographies currently experiencing the most acute security stress in Nigeria overlap almost exactly with the geographies that are the most contested electoral swing zones. That overlap is not coincidental. When security conditions deteriorate in regions that are also electoral battlegrounds, the political consequences are specific and calculable. Voter turnout suppresses in areas where a challenger is strong, while mobilization continues in areas where the incumbent structure has deeper roots. Security instability in this framework is not simply a governance failure. In some contexts, it functions as an electoral instrument. The interfaith and interethnic framing that Nigerians are accustomed to hearing around every election cycle is real in its social consequences, but secondary in its structural causation. Political actors who cannot win on governance performance activate identity cleavages because identity mobilization is cheaper and faster than institutional reform. The activation of those cleavages, the careful use of religious language, the strategic deployment of ethnic grievance has social costs that persist long after election day. The distrust that is seeded in communities during an election campaign does not dissolve when the results are announced. It becomes the texture of daily life. And every Nigerian, regardless of which identity group they belong to, lives inside that texture. The international dimension of this analysis is often either overstated or ignored entirely. The reality is more nuanced. The United States and the European Union have both made public statements about Nigerian democratic integrity following the 2023 election cycle. Those statements reflected genuine concern at the diplomatic level. But Western government's leverage over Nigerian electoral outcomes is constrained by a set of strategic realities that Nigerian political actors understand perfectly well. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy. It is a critical partner in counter-terrorism operations across the Sahel. It is a significant energy supplier with relationships that matter to Western energy security calculations. When strategic interests are this significant, democracy rhetoric is calibrated carefully. Nigerian political actors on all sides know that Western governments will issue statements, conduct observer missions, and express concern. They also know that those same governments will engage with whoever wins because the strategic relationship with Nigeria is not conditional on the cleanliness of any single election. The diaspora dimension, however, is where international pressure could be more consequential than most analysts suggest. Nigerians in the UK, the US, Canada, and across Europe remit more than $20 billion annually into the Nigerian economy. That figure exceeds Nigeria's foreign direct investment inflows in most years. Political instability following a disputed 2027 election would hit diaspora families directly through exchange rate volatility, through security risks to relatives at home, and through the investment uncertainty that follows contested political transitions. Nigerian diaspora Nigerians are not passive observers. They are increasingly organized as political constituencies within their host countries with lobbying capacity and media access that can shape international narratives around Nigerian democracy. Their understanding of what is being assembled right now has real implications for what pressure can be applied at a critical moment.
The broader global pattern is also instructive. What is unfolding in Nigeria is not unique. The same model of pre-election structural capture, using institutional leverage, patronage flows, and the quiet co-optation of mid-tier political figures has been documented in Hungary, in Turkey, and across several West African states over the last decade. In each case, the mechanism was not traditional electoral fraud. There were no mass ballot stuffings. There were no crude falsifications that courts could easily address. The outcome was shaped before election day through the patient assembly of structural advantages. That is precisely what makes this form of capture so difficult to challenge legally
and so important to understand analytically. Before we get to the strategic outlook, it is important to address the strongest counter-arguments honestly. Some will say Nigerian elections have always been competitive and unpredictable. 2015 proved that incumbents can lose. This is true, but it actually confirms the analysis rather than refuting it. The 2015 outcome was not a spontaneous voter uprising. It was the product of a structural realignment that was engineered 24 months in advance using precisely the mechanisms described in this video. The lesson of 2015 is not that structure does not matter. It is that structure can be disrupted, but only by those who build an alternative structure early enough. Others will argue that INEC has been meaningfully reformed, that the 2022 Electoral Act represents genuine progress, and that the institutional environment for 2027 is cleaner than it was in previous cycles. This is also true, and also incomplete. Institutional reform and institutional independence are not the same thing. The legal framework has improved. The operational and political environment within which that framework must function has not changed at the same pace. And some will say the Nigerian voter is too sophisticated to be manipulated, too politically aware to be demobilized, too numerous to be overcome by elite structural maneuvering. This is the most important counter-argument, and it deserves the most honest response. Voter sophistication is real. The engagement and political awareness of ordinary Nigerians across all regions and all demographics is a genuine democratic asset. But that sophistication operates within an institutional environment. A sophisticated voter in a ward where the party delegate machinery has already been captured faces structural obstacles that individual awareness alone cannot overcome. Sophistication requires infrastructure to translate into outcomes. And infrastructure is exactly what is being contested right now, 18 months before most Nigerians start paying attention. The most misleading narrative circulating in Nigerian political discourse is the one that frames this as a North versus South story, or a Christian versus Muslim story. That framing serves the structural actors perfectly, because it redirects analytical attention to the wrong level. The mechanism is institutional and financial, not ethnic or religious. When the conversation becomes about identity, the people engineering the structural capture are relieved of scrutiny. The second most damaging narrative is the cynical one, that all politicians are the same, that nothing can change, that engagement is pointless. That narrative produces exactly the demobilization that structural capture requires to succeed. Whatever your region, whatever your faith, whatever your party, the question of whether Nigerian elections are structurally predetermined is a question that affects every Nigerian with equal force. A Kano voter, a Port Harcourt voter, and an Enugu voter share a fundamental interest in elections that are genuinely competitive, that reflect genuine popular will, and that produce governments with a genuine mandate to govern. That shared interest is the foundation on which a national conversation about 2027 must be built, and it is precisely that foundation which structural capture is designed to erode. So, what do you actually watch for in the months ahead? There are 3 concrete signals that will tell you whether this structural consolidation is accelerating or being contested. Watch the sequencing of federal appointments against political defection announcements. When a major political figure crosses party lines within weeks of a federal appointment flowing into his state, you are watching the transaction, not the coincidence. The sequencing is the signal. Watch the amendments being proposed to the Electoral Act in the current National Assembly session. The specific provisions that attract the most resistance, those around primary election processes, delegate allocation formulas, and results transmission requirements, will tell you exactly which structural advantages are being protected and which are being contested. And watch which civil society organizations receive federal support and which find their operating environments becoming more difficult. Civil society's independent monitoring capacity is one of the most important variables in determining whether a disputed election produces accountability or impunity. Those who understand this are already moving to shape that environment. Now, I promised you 2 resolutions. Here is the first. The single most important institutional lever in this entire operation is not INEC, It is the State Independent Electoral Commissions, the SIECs. They control local government elections. Local government elections determine ward structures. Ward structures determine primary delegates. Primary delegates determine who appears on the presidential ballot. Control the SIECs, control the primaries. Control the primaries, and the general election is decided before it begins. That is the architecture.
And here is the second. The actor who has stayed completely silent throughout all of this, no press statements, no political positioning, no public commentary, is not a politician. It is the organized private sector, the major conglomerates and federal contractors whose fiscal exposure to political risk is the highest of any constituency in Nigeria. They have already made their assessment. They have already made their choice. Their silence is not neutrality. It is strategic patience. They are simply waiting for the rest of Nigeria to reach the same conclusion they reached months ago. We started this video with a question. If the 2027 election is being decided by structural power assembled right now, who is building that structure and who handed them the tools to do it? The answer, as you now understand, is not a single villain. It is not a single party. It is a system, a set of institutional incentives, patronage flows, and strategic silences that rewards those who move early and punishes those who wait for the campaign season to begin. The Nigerian voter is not powerless in this, but power in this context requires understanding the game before it ends. That understanding starts here, and it continues in the comments below. Your analysis, your questions, your counter-arguments. This is not a monologue, it is a national conversation. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.